good afternoon to you, and maybe almost evening. And good afternoon to me as well from Florida. Thank you for your invitation. I'm Derya Akkaynak, and I am very happy to be here today as an oceanographer, but more than an oceanographer, a person who cares deeply about the ocean and the planet, to talk to you about a few aspects of confusion I see with climate change and climate change language, at least in my world. I'll briefly tell you about how I structured today's talk. So I'm going to take just 10 minutes to tell you very short sentences about my background and the work I do, my ongoing projects, and then I'll spend the rest of the time to share some of my observations around climate change language. So very briefly, I was born and raised in Turkey, and by training, I'm an aerospace engineer. And when I graduated, I also got my master's in aerospace engineering at MIT. And at that time, I was specializing in the thermodynamic efficiency of aircraft engines, so the jet engines you travel on, jet airplanes. And I really did not feel any passion about any aspect of that. So I said, okay, let's work in the industry for a bit. Let's see what that's like. So I started consulting after my master's, and I worked as an IT, information technology consultant, for several years. And that was still when I was in my 20s. So I made, for my 20s, a lot of money. I traveled a lot. I had access to good things, but I realized all my days were being spent in an office, almost from before sunrise to after sunset. And I was essentially missing the changing of the seasons year after year. So at some point I stopped and I said, okay, what is a job I can do that will help me maintain a connection to nature, and more specifically to the ocean? And it was when I was almost 30 that I decided I'm going back to school to become an oceanographer. And I did. I went back to MIT and Woods Hole Oceanographic to get my PhD, finished in 2014, and never looked back. Since then, I have worked in Panama, Germany, Israel, back in the US. For the last couple of years, I was a scientist actually in Florida, Harbor Branch Oceanographic. And next month, I am moving on to become an associate professor in the beautiful Red Sea in the town of Eilat, Israel. So this is basically what the lab looks like in Eilat. And I'm saying this because most people who hear that I'm from Turkey and I'm getting a job in Israel and I lived half of my life in the US, their automatic assumption is that I must be a spy. But you, of all people, know that this is not true, because had I been a spy, I could have probably just picked up a passport from my underwear drawer and be in Scotland for this week, whereas my passport prevented me from getting a visa on time and for quite a few $100s. And so I'm joining you from Zoom. So with that out of the way, a little bit about me, my professional background. My work, of course, background being in physics and aerospace and thermodynamics and engineering, I have a very diverse set of research areas where I can apply, bring in different skills. But most of the time, I find myself working at the intersection of ocean optics, computer vision, and visual ecology, which means how does vision help animals that live in aquatic worlds see and live and find mates and defend themselves, and so on. And the reason for this slide is to tell you that I am not a climate scientist. I don't do research in any aspect of the climate or language. So everything I will share with you today will be from my personal observations as a simple person who has a world divided in 3 interesting countries: Turkey, Israel, and the US. So with that, a few examples of my work, of my ongoing projects. I'll tell you briefly about the really cool ability of cuttlefishes to camouflage. And then I'll tell you a bit about sea turtle color vision, and very briefly about reconstruction of lost colors in the photographs we take underwater. So I'm going to start with camouflage with this video, and this was taken by my PhD advisor, Dr. Roger Hanlon, some years ago. So the video, I imagine to you, it will be a bit slower than what it really is, but it doesn't matter. Just watch, focus on the rock as the camera is approaching the rock. And I'm sure many of you have seen this numerous times because it's a very famous video. So as you just watch the rock, you see that it is not a rock, rather it was an octopus camouflaging on the rock. And the only reason why Roger was able to film this is because he had been chasing the octopus with his camera and he saw that it settled on the rock. Now it's going to play backwards. Just watch the change in the skin, which starts between the eyes where the brain is, and then the coloration spreads all the way to the animal's skin. And they can do this kind of change to blend in with their backgrounds within a matter of milliseconds. But what's probably the most impressive about this is not that they can do it in milliseconds, but they are colorblind. They cannot sense the colors around them, but yet they can produce an appearance that matches them. So I've been working in the lab with cuttlefish, which are cousins of octopus, and they have the same incredible ability. And I've been giving them these crazy backgrounds, checkerboard, sine waves, cow patterns, and a bunch of others, and time-lapsing them from the time I put these cuttlefish into the arena to the time they display a peaceful, settled camouflage pattern, and they actually settle somewhere on the pattern. And the goal is not to send them to cuttlefish hell with these crazy patterns, but really to understand when they decide to choose a pattern, what aspects of the background are they taking into account to decide on that pattern. These patterns are not natural, but I know their statistics exactly because I designed them. So this is one of my ongoing fun projects. The other one is the color vision adaptations in the sea turtle eyes. Now, sea turtles are very cool. We as humans, we are trichromatic. That means we have 3 color cones in our eyes, and that allows us to see the parts of the light electromagnetic spectrum that's generally called as red, green, and blue. But turtles have a 4th color cone, which is sensitive to ultraviolet. So already they're a bit ahead of us in their colorful world. But in addition to that, they also have these little lenses, these little oil droplets on their retina. So imagine you put a lens, a filter on your camera lens, which gives it a particular effect. They have that lens on every single photoreceptor in their retina. So almost imagine in your camera on every pixel. So what's the role of this oil droplets that is all scattered across the turtle retina? Because the only other animals that have this are birds. And in birds, theoretically, it's shown that these droplets help them see and discriminate more colors, which makes a lot of sense because birds live in terrestrial habitats. There's beautiful sunlight. All colors can be visible, but with all due respect, turtles themselves are not as colorful as birds, and they live in habitats that are chromatically dull. Ocean habitats are not, because of the watercolor, that colorful. So what's the role of this? To investigate this, I built a camera that sees the world like a sea turtle. And we could not do this with cameras designed for human vision because, as I said, they have an ultraviolet cone and they also have these oil droplets. So I took this camera, went diving with the goal of taking imagery to process according to a turtle visual system, a real one, and then a turtle visual system without oil droplets. And that's really cool. Here are the preliminary results. So on the left, you see the same real world underwater footage processed according to a real turtle, a turtle who has these oil droplets. And on the right, the same footage processed to a turtle who didn't have these oil droplets. And the difference, even qualitatively, without cranking out any numbers, in the number of colors and the discriminability of colors is pretty striking. So there is some importance of these oil droplets for turtles. We are working on explaining that now. That's ongoing research, but I just wanted to show a snippet from this. And the final project I want to tell you is sort of what I work on these days, my main project. And it's actually eventually relates to climate. It's the problem of color reconstruction in underwater photos. So the problem is very simple to define. If you have an image that was taken in an underwater habitat at some depth, in some water with certain optical qualities, at some distance with some sensor, and you don't know any of these things, can you take that image and can you restore the colors in a way as if the water body was not there? And that's actually a very hard problem, because if the ocean had always only been blue, or if the properties of the ocean water had always been constant or at least predictable, it could have been a simpler problem. But the truth is the global ocean is highly variable in terms of the type and concentration of the particles in it. And it's those particles that give the water its dominant color. You always hear the ocean is blue, blue ocean. That's only true for the open ocean. The coastal ocean, where we do the majority of our scientific imaging, actually is rarely blue. And it could be a whole range of natural hues due to natural reasons. So this color restoration problem is very difficult, but just to highlight the connection of colors and their significance for the role of the ocean in the world's climate, I want to take you back to 1989 for 1 second. So this map you see here, which was on the cover of the scientific journal published in 1989, is the first map showing the concentration of the stuff in the water column in the ocean globally for the first time. And by stuff, I mean phytoplankton. That's just a fancy word to say tiny microscopic organisms that live in the water, use sunlight to produce food, to photosynthesize, and that food is the base food for everything else in the ocean to eat. So to be able to quantify the concentration of these particles is extremely important. And this in 1989, it took 10 years to make this map. And in the 60s and 70s, when scientists said, we can use satellites and we can sense the ocean remotely from space, and we can try to get the concentrations of these organisms from space, everybody else laughed at them. They said, you're crazy. We will never measure anything from space for the ocean. It will never make sense. And of course, fast forward some decades, we can do this from space every day at extremely high resolution, and we almost do it around the hour. So this is what ocean color looks like from space. And actually, this being able to relate color to the concentration of stuff in the water really revolutionized oceanography as we know it. Because previously, when scientists were on a vessel and they took samples from different parts of the ocean, they assumed between those points where they sampled, everything varied linearly. But now, you can see there is nothing here that varies linearly or smoothly. So the ability to use color to gain scientific insights throughout the whole globe is extremely important, because it tells us that there is phytoplankton. Phytoplankton photosynthesize, meaning they produce food. When you produce food, you use up carbon dioxide. And when you use carbon dioxide, you need to be able to quantify that so you can relate it to the global carbon cycle and have insights about the ocean's role in the climate. So this is extremely important. However, in my work, the fact that the ocean water has color is a huge problem, because I don't care about what's in the water column itself. I care about what's in the bottom of the ocean, what animals, what organisms live there, how they are structured and how they function. So one of my challenges and maybe accomplishments is that I have found a way to remove this water and the effects due to the water out of photographs we take. So this, for example, is a scene from Florida Keys. And when we take that water out of these photographs, we can actually see the habitats on the ocean floor as if we photographed them on land. So as much as watercolor is helpful for understanding the ocean's role in the global climate, getting rid of that water column is helpful in understanding the health of the flora and fauna of whatever's in the bottom of the ocean. So essentially, this summarizes to you the current projects that I'm working on. And as I said, none of these relate directly to studies of climate, but I have, over the years, also being very overly concerned with what I see every day in the scope of being an oceanographer, have formulated some thoughts that I'm excited to share in this context around climate language. So I think, as I express it to myself, I liken the dynamics around climate change science, language, and activism to the Penrose Triangle. So the Penrose Triangle is not a real triangle. It's actually an impossible triangle. There cannot exist such a triangle in the real world, but a weird shape, when viewed from a specific angle, can appear like a triangle. So if you have only looked at a concept from that specific angle, you have always seen it as a triangle, so you think it's a triangle and you believe it's a triangle, whereas it's really an impossibility. So using this as my main framework for thinking, I, to myself, identified 3 different ways that this real world, but not so perceivable disconnect between the science of climate and the language and the activism is actually costing us in time and money and progress in the real battle to actually slow down climate change. And those 3 ways are climate change used as a shield, climate change as an element of identity, and climate change as the identity element. Now, what does any of this mean? Let me explain a bit further. So climate change as a shield is my thought around the vagueness, the passiveness of the term climate change that, of course, many of us immediately regretted even when we first got familiar with it. And the proper term that was coined was anthropogenic climate change, but there's no way you can use that in daily language. So even though we tried changing it to changing climate, climate crisis, climate catastrophe, climate emergency, none of it really stuck as much as climate change did. So climate change, the vagueness of it, is, at least as I observe it, very effectively being used to cover up bad management, lack of policy, lack of regulation, corruption, exploitation, and all kinds of local insults by people of power, people in powerful positions. These are politicians, policymakers, local managers, and they use this to cover up their lack of governance in every way possible. Because once you say it's caused by climate change, and here it doesn't matter what it is, then you're automatically waiving or slashing your responsibility in whatever it was. And I've seen this happen with two different backings. One of these is It's caused by climate change. And you know, seasons change, so does climate. It's natural. It's just everything. It's not part of the natural process. And the other way I've seen this used is it's caused by climate change, and climate change is caused by developed countries. We are victims of it. There is nothing we can do. And what does all of this mean? Now, let me show you a couple of examples. So what you are looking at here, as hard to believe, is actually a scene from the Marmara Sea in Turkey. You can see the boats, even though it looks like a solid concrete bottom, it's actually the sea, the surface of the sea. And the stuff on the surface is called sea snot or mucilage. And this is caused by an explosion of the population of certain microorganisms, which can include those organisms I just mentioned that make up the color of the ocean, the phytoplankton, but also some bacteria, whatever. But it happens when there is so much nutrients that these organisms grow uncontrollably, of course, with the help of other conditions, and take over. Now, it's not just on the surface. Actually, it's all throughout the water column. And the most important consequence of this disgusting sea snot is that it takes up oxygen. So it eliminates oxygen from the water column for all the animals that live in that sea to survive. And it sinks to the bottom as a thick blanket covering everything, all life on the bottom. And the animals that are sessile, the animals that cannot move, are doomed. They cannot breathe, they cannot escape from it, and that's the end of it. So this is not just a disgusting effect on the surface, it's all throughout, it's not superficial. And when I say climate change being used as a shield, this is a prime example, because everything you just saw actually happened. The imagery was from this last summer. And then it was all over the news in Turkey and abroad that this disgusting thing was caused by global heating or global warming. And was it? So no. First of all, the phenomena itself, the formation of the sea snot is natural. So it happens actually pretty much everywhere all the time, but not at these scales. So what makes it noticeable to the human eye, to happen at the degree that it's noticeable to our eyes, is the addition of nutrients. And by that, I mean nitrogen and phosphorus, which comes from unprocessed or insufficiently processed wastewater being dumped into the water body. And this is exactly what's happening in the Marmara Sea. This phenomenon was first visible to the eye in 1997. So imagine the accumulation of wastewater that had to happen so that it first became visible in 1997 and only got worse from that time. So what did climate change cause here? By warming the water, climate change allowed this process to happen for a longer duration and happen at higher frequency intervals. So it, just like with a lot of other events in the planet, it accelerated, it intensified because of climate change. But was it caused by climate change? No, it was not. But did the local managers, even more than local managers, national managers, use this as an excuse to hide their responsibility in mismanagement and essentially just exploitation of all the resources? Yes, of course they did, because in a setup where many people believe in bigger powers or concepts like heaven and hell and things that cannot be quantifiably proven or disproven to exist, when you say it happened and it's caused by climate change, it's not hard for that unseen powerful thing of climate change to be accepted as an explanation. So the vagueness in the term itself, climate change, just by being so vague and so weak, is actually allowing people who perhaps in the first place, whose actions and policies initiate or contribute or accelerate climate change, to make it even worse. So what could be a solution to this? Of course, the solution to the problem of mucilage is not to vacuum it from the surface of the water, although if your local municipality looks like they're doing it, then they look like they're doing something. So it's like a band-aid of a solution. And of course, the physical solution is to immediately stop dumping every drop of sewage that is being dumped from residential and commercial areas. And of course, for the physics-based reasons of this to be shared and monitored continuously, but those are the physical scientific solutions. In terms of narrative, what would stop us from electing people to office again who will not cause or contribute to this kind of problem amplifying in the future? And in my extremely personal opinion, again, none of this is professional, that language, that narrative has to be one around ethics. If you are not able to process your wastewater to a degree that you can pour it into a glass and drink it, then you should not find the right in yourself to dump that water into a habitat where non-human organisms live. Just because you are human does not give you the right to destroy the habitats of all other living things. So this is, of course, a huge idealistic approach, but it's really, in my mind, this is the narrative that can stop the next local leader from making the kinds of decisions that lead to this scale of a disaster. So this is what I meant by climate change being used as a shield. Now I'll move on to the second way that I think this vague language is harming us. And that's something I called climate change as an element of identity. And what do I mean by that? There is quite a few people, young people, old people, doesn't matter, people everywhere, who care really deeply, intimately about climate change, and they believe something must be done and it should be done ASAP. So this is really, really good. These people care about climate change and they speak about it and they act and they campaign. But they do it for all the wrong reasons, and they do it in all the wrong ways that actually also hurt the true battle towards slowing down climate change. So what do I mean by this? Perhaps the poster child example of this, at least in my field, is coral restoration. The amount of time and money and resources poured into coral restoration is truly unbelievable, given that its effect in the long term for the reefs and for acting as a solution towards climate change is extremely small. So I'll just show you a couple of examples around the language around reef restoration. Don't get me wrong, I am not at all saying we should not work on restoring reefs or funds should not be channeled towards reef restoration projects. Of course, we should do everything in our power to learn more about reefs and how we can propagate them and what makes them survive better in different conditions. I am all for that. It's just around the language, I have a few examples. So how can we save coral reefs? Maybe by 3D printing reefs. Maybe coral farms will save coral reefs. Maybe coral sex, in other words, producing more larvae and throwing into the water will save coral reefs. Maybe we will use gene hacking. Maybe that's how we can save coral reefs. Maybe it's fish social lives that will help us save coral reefs. But how about artificial intelligence and 360-degree cameras to save coral reefs? But maybe the recipe is really adding more fish to save coral reefs. But actually, sea cucumbers are the best solution. So this might be the way we can end up preserving coral reefs. Actually, fish pee might be a better way to go about saving coral reefs. So if that didn't convince you, maybe we can save coral reefs by t-shirts. And this, you know, all of this is well-intentioned, but it's all for the wrong reasons, because there is only one thing that can change the future of coral reefs, and that is changing the human behavior. That is reducing emissions. And none of these amazing studies or well-meaning efforts did that get communicated. And that's most definitely not a shortcoming of the people who are working to do this. It's most definitely not the well-meaning journalists who are trying to share these, but it's just the baseline of how we understand and communicate climate. So now I want to take this to one level above. I said the only thing that can save coral reefs is changing human behavior, right? Okay, so let's say we manage to change human behavior in a way that we produce less greenhouse gas emissions. That's excellent. So that's the next level of person who advocates for electric cars. Instead of gasoline-powered cars, we should have electric cars. And today, there is about 1 billion gasoline-powered cars on the planet, according to some estimate. And imagine tomorrow if there were to be 1 billion electric cars, if everybody everywhere was going to drive an electric car, how are the rare metals that the batteries of these cars going to use going to be produced? Where are they going to come from? And it looks like the most likely place they are going to be coming from is going to be the ocean, the deep ocean floor, from these polymetallic rocks that are peacefully resting on the bottom of the ocean. So today we have a problem with big oil companies dredging and exploiting deep ocean for fossil fuels, right? And tomorrow, if we all drive electric cars, and to do that, we simply give the license to those big oil companies to then mine these big rocks on the seafloor, we have changed nothing. Yes, we are producing less emissions, but the way we live, the status quo, is exactly the same. So this narrative also, even though it's well-meaning and it has the right aspects, it's taking us away from the actual things we need to be focusing about with our language on climate. So these folks, where I identified as them identifying climate change as a part of their identity, they don't mean to do this, but they're actually numbing the narrative for everybody else in the world. They are taking attention and resources away from the real problems that need to be addressed. And they're creating this illusion of there are solutions and things are being done, whereas we are not even chipping away at the actual solution. So this sort of bridges me to my last observation, which was climate change as the identity element. And I'll take a breath here and hopefully give you guys a chance to ask you, do you all remember from third grade math what the identity element was? So for example, if there's a number and you multiply it by 1, you get the same number. The number doesn't change. And that's the identity element in multiplication. If you add 0 to a number, the number doesn't change. It remains unchanged, you get the same number, and 0 is the identity element for addition. So by identity element here, what I mean, and I apologize if it's a bit nerdy, but it describes for me perfectly the situation, is the fact that there is a group of people who know about climate change. They understand the causes, they understand the consequences. But all that information, all that exposure, all that understanding changes nothing about the way they live. So here, the vagueness of the climate change concept, terminology, is the identity element. Most of the time, maybe some of the time, these people believe they understand the situation, but they believe there's nothing in their power to be done. As individuals, they don't have the power to do enough to change or slow down climate change. But most of the time, it is because these people are trying to survive, and thinking or worrying about climate change is a luxury for them, because the language of the terminology of climate change is so passive and it's so privileged that it turns off the people who are actually in the most need of understanding and caring for climate change, the ones who are going to be affected the most. It's not directly relevant, but I actually lived in my lifetime another scenario like this, where the vagueness and the ineffectiveness of communicating such an important concept was so key, and failure to do that resulted in really bad consequences. And this was about 20 years ago when I was in college, and when just in the time of the elections that the Islamist party in Turkey had come to power. And before the elections, you had the left party going to people's houses and knocking door to door and saying, you have to vote for us, you can't vote for them because they are going to take our secularism away, and we are going to be a backwards country where men and women are not going to have the same equal rights. And these people were saying, I don't care, I'm starving. My children are starving. My children don't have shoes to wear. I don't care if we are not secular. I'm going to vote for the side that's going to give me food. And as much as our elite left party had an understanding of how important secularism was for our society, they completely failed to communicate that, and people completely didn't care because they were trying to survive. So if you need to eat, you cannot care about climate change. I just want to show a quantitative example to this. Unfortunately, Turkey happens to have the most polluted part of the entire Mediterranean Sea in terms of plastic pollution, submerged underwater, according to estimates published by various scientists from various countries. Now, do people know this? Yes, because even though this study specifically talks about pollution and plastic mountains on the seafloor, and of course, not everybody gets to seafloor every day, you don't have to look at the seafloor. You also see a reflection of that on land where people pass by every day on their way to work. They see it, they know it. They know this is not okay for their environment. They know this is not okay for their health, but they don't have the time to pause and stop to do anything about it because they have to survive. They cannot not go to work that day to do something about this or to say something about it. So it's these people who actually we need to reach out the most to, that we cannot. So in the last year and a half with COVID, because I have been stuck at home like everybody else and I didn't have to commute to work, I had a lot of free time, and I did a lot of outreach to kindergartens, primary schools, high schools, universities, clubs, and companies in Turkey, talking about marine science and climate and other issues. And throughout those interactions, I sort of developed a pretty straightforward, in my mind, way of talking to them about climate, and not as climate change, but just in these terms that will touch them today in their state of starving and not being able to provide for their families or living low quality lives. So I start like this. Are you poor? Are you unhealthy? Are you unhappy? Do you feel that you are working a lot, but you are not making enough? Well, the same reasons that cause you to be poor are the same reasons why the climate is changing. because it's the same forces that are exploiting you, your family, and your labor that are also exploiting the planet. Even though it seems like a luxury, you need to be aware of the climate and you need to care for the changes in climate, because it means you will become poorer, you will become unhealthier, and you will become unhappier, and your children even will live a worse life than you do now. So when we say just climate change, loss of biodiversity, and all these things that don't mean much to that person in that moment, it seems like this way of rather raw communication does find a response in them. And what can they do? That's the next question, because they already feel like they are unimportant small beings in the world that are just being exploited. What is in my power to do? And I tell them, there's one thing you can do. Vote for the people who understand what is going on when we take humans and planet to separate sides and pretend like they can exist mutually exclusive of each other, and vote for people who promise to take solid actions, because planet's future is your future and the future of your children. Actually, with that, that's all I had. So I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts and a discussion on if any of these resonated with you. Thank you.